The Joe Rogan Experience special live episode featuring congressional oversight debate had been promoted as what podcast producers characterized as unprecedented, long-form political discussion, bringing together Joe Rogan, whose massive audience and whose reputation for asking challenging questions without predetermined ideological constraints had made him arguably most influential podcaster in America, and Representative Jasmine Crockett, whose constitutional expertise and whose demonstrated ability to engage substantively with complex questions had made her sought-after guest for serious political dialogue that Rogan's format uniquely enabled through hours-long conversations, impossible in traditional media. Joe Rogan sat in his Austin studio as podcaster, whose evolution from comedian and UFC commentator to cultural phenomenon whose interviews reached tens of millions had given him platform where a single episode could shape public discourse more effectively than weeks of traditional media coverage, whose questioning style combined genuine curiosity with willingness to challenge guests' assumptions, regardless of their credentials or status, and whose recent political commentary had positioned him as independent voice, skeptical of governmental institutions and progressive policies that he viewed as reflecting elite disconnect from working Americans whose concerns his audience shared and whose perspectives mainstream media often dismissed or misrepresented. Jasmine Crockett had accepted invitation to appear on Joe Rogan Experience, recognizing that his audience represented demographic crucial to reaching beyond typical political media consumers. Her willingness to participate in multi-hour, unstructured conversation reflecting confidence that substantive engagement would resonate with Rogan's listeners, who valued authentic dialogue over scripted political messaging that traditional interviews typically produced. The conversation had been proceeding for over 90 minutes through various topics when Joe Rogan had begun pursuing line of questioning that regular listeners recognized as him building toward challenge he genuinely wanted answered rather than toward gotcha moment designed to embarrass guest. His questions reflecting real skepticism about whether congressional investigations represented legitimate accountability or had become partisan witch hunts where evidence was manufactured or exaggerated to justify predetermined conclusions that progressive politicians reached before investigations even began. Then Joe Rogan had posed what was clearly his most serious challenge, a question delivered without hostility, but with evident conviction about whether Crockett could honestly claim that congressional investigations she supported were truly evidence-based, rather than politically motivated, citing specific high-profile investigations that conservatives argued had been launched without solid evidence and that mainstream media had breathlessly covered, despite investigations ultimately not producing the criminal charges or findings that initial reporting had suggested were imminent. His challenge clearly coming from a place of genuine concern that governmental investigatory power was being abused through process, where investigations became punishment regardless of outcomes and where political opponents could be damaged. Through investigatory theater, even when evidence didn't support the allegations that justified launching investigations, demanding that she explain how Americans should trust congressional oversight, when recent history seemed to show investigations were often fishing expeditions, hoping to find evidence rather than being launched because evidence already existed warranting examination. What Joe Rogan could not have anticipated was that Crockett would respond not with defensive assertions about congressional prerogatives or with general principles about accountability and necessity, but rather with evidence so comprehensive and so specific in documenting that the investigations Rogan was citing as supposedly evidence-free had actually been based on substantial documented evidence that he apparently wasn't aware of, despite his confident characterization of them as politically motivated fishing expeditions, that when she systematically presented the actual evidence basis for investigations, he had characterized as evidence-free, including criminal referrals, inspector general reports, documented violations, and specific factual predicates that had triggered investigations he was claiming were launched without foundation. Her evidence would leave him literally frozen in recognition that his understanding of these investigations had been shaped by media narratives that hadn't accurately conveyed the evidentiary foundations that comprehensive presentation would prove had existed, despite his confident assertions to the contrary. If you want to see what happens when influential podcaster challenges congressional member about whether investigations are evidence-based, expecting to expose political motivation, and that member responds with comprehensive evidence, proving the Investigations had substantial documented foundations that the questioner wasn't aware of. Leaving him frozen as his confident challenge collapses through evidence he can't dispute, subscribe to this channel immediately because we are going to examine every element of how Crockett's evidence left Rogan frozen, and why this moment became legendary for demonstrating that challenges to investigations' evidentiary foundations require actually knowing what evidence existed rather than assuming. Based on media narratives that investigations were politically motivated when systematic evidence presentation proves they were grounded in documented facts. Rogan's challenge to Crockett had come during their discussion about congressional investigations and accountability. He had been building his skepticism about whether investigations were genuinely evidence-based before posing his direct challenge. Rogan had said, "Jasmine, I want to ask you about something that's been bothering me about these congressional investigations. And I'm asking this genuinely because I want to understand how you justify what looks to me like political witch hunts disguised as legitimate oversight." The Joe Rogan Experience studio had the characteristic intimacy of his long-form conversations, with Rogan's tone making clear this was sincere question rather than hostile attack. Rogan had continued, "Take the Russia investigation. Congress launched massive investigation into Trump-Russia collusion. Media covered it for years, like it was proven fact. But Mueller report didn't establish criminal conspiracy. So was there actually evidence justifying that investigation? Or was it political hit job, where investigation itself was the punishment, regardless of outcome? Or take the Hunter Biden laptop story. That was dismissed as Russian disinformation by intelligence officials. Media and politicians said it was fake, but it turned out to be real. So how do I trust that congressional investigations are evidence-based when the evidence seems to get manufactured or dismissed depending on political convenience? He had delivered his core challenge because, Jasmine, from where I sit, it looks like congressional investigations get launched based on political motivation rather than on actual evidence, and then investigation becomes punishment. You damage people through investigatory process even if you don't find crimes. That seems like abuse of power to me. So how do you justify supporting aggressive congressional investigations when recent history shows they're often fishing expeditions rather than evidence-based accountability? How do Americans watching this trust that oversight is legitimate rather than political weapon? The challenge had been delivered with Rogan's characteristic directness and genuine engagement, clearly reflecting his real concerns rather than scripted talking points. But what happened next would leave Rogan frozen through evidence he clearly hadn't anticipated. Crockett had listened carefully, had pulled out prepared materials, and had begun systematically presenting evidence that would prove his characterization was based on incomplete information. Crockett had responded, "Joe, thank you for that question, because it lets me address misconceptions about these investigations' evidentiary foundations. You cited specific examples, Russia investigation. Hunter Biden laptop as evidence that congressional investigations aren't evidence-based. So let me walk through what actually triggered those investigations and what evidence existed. Because I think your characterization is based on incomplete understanding of the evidentiary record." She had displayed first set of documents, the Russia investigation. You suggested it was launched without evidence and that Mueller didn't find criminal conspiracy, implying investigation was baseless. But Joe, let's look at what actually triggered that investigation and what it found. The investigation was triggered by George Papadopoulos telling Australian diplomat that Russians had dirt on Clinton. That diplomat reported it to FBI. That's not politically motivated, that's foreign. Government reporting potential foreign interference. Then, during investigation, evidence emerged, Trump Tower meeting, where campaign officials met with Russians offering dirt on Clinton. Michael Flynn lying to FBI about Russian contacts, Paul Manafort sharing campaign data with Russian intelligence operative. Multiple Trump campaign contacts with Russians that campaign repeatedly lied about. The Joe Rogan Experience studio had become intensely focused as Crockett presented specific, documented evidence. Crockett had continued, Mueller report documented substantial evidence of Russian interference and Trump campaign contacts with Russians. What Mueller didn't establish was criminal conspiracy meeting specific legal standard. But that doesn't mean investigation lacked evidentiary basis. Joe, the evidence of Russian interference in campaign contacts was substantial. That's why investigation was justified. Mueller report led to multiple criminal convictions: Manafort, Flynn, Papadopoulos, Rick Gates, Roger Stone, Michael Cohen. So the investigation produced evidence of criminal conduct even though it didn't establish the specific criminal conspiracy of coordinated election interference. She had then addressed his second example, Hunter Biden laptop. You said it was dismissed as Russian disinformation but turned out to be real, suggesting that shows evidence gets manufactured or dismissed politically. But Joe, let me give you actual timeline with evidence. In October 2020, Rudy Giuliani provided laptop contents to New York Post. Intelligence officials, not congressional, investigators said it had hallmarks of Russian disinformation operation. Based on how it surfaced and on Russia's history of such operations, the laptop contents were eventually authenticated. But congressional investigation of Hunter Biden's business dealings wasn't based on just the laptop. Joe, it was based on bank records showing millions in foreign payments. Testimony from business associates documented communications. The investigation had evidentiary foundation beyond the disputed laptop. She had then delivered what would leave Rogan frozen. So Joe, you challenge me to justify evidence-based investigations by citing two examples you characterized as evidence-free political witch hunts. But, I've just shown you, Russia investigation was triggered by foreign government reporting potential interference. Documented multiple Russian contacts with campaign that campaign lied about, produced multiple criminal convictions, and was justified. By substantial evidence, even though it didn't establish specific conspiracy charge, Hunter Biden investigation was based on bank records, testimony, and documented business dealings, not just on disputed laptop. Your characterization of these as evidence-free. Fishing expeditions is based on media narratives that didn't convey the actual evidentiary foundations. When you look at what actually triggered investigations and what evidence existed, they were evidence-based even when outcomes didn't match initial media speculation. She had concluded, Joe, I know your audience values getting full picture rather than media spin. So I'm giving you documented evidence showing that investigations you cited as supposedly baseless actually had substantial evidentiary foundations that justified congressional examination. You can disagree with whether investigations were worth pursuing or whether media coverage was appropriate, but you can't accurately claim they lacked evidentiary basis when the actual record shows they were triggered by documented evidence and produced additional evidence of misconduct even when they didn't result in specific charges you might have expected based on media coverage. The Joe Rogan Experience studio sat in profound silence. Joe Rogan appeared literally frozen, his expression showing he was processing evidence that contradicted his confident characterization of these investigations as politically motivated witch hunts lacking evidentiary foundation. After what felt like very long pause, Rogan had responded with characteristic honesty. Okay, I didn't know all that detail about what triggered Russia investigation. I knew Mueller didn't establish conspiracy, and I interpreted that as meaning investigation was baseless. But you're saying there was substantial evidence of Russian interference in campaign contacts, even though conspiracy wasn't established legally. That's different from how I understood it, he had continued. And the Hunter Biden stuff focused on the laptop being dismissed, then authenticated, and I saw that as proof of political bias. But you're saying investigation was based on broader evidence beyond just the laptop. That changes how I think about whether it was justified. Jamie Vernon, Rogan's producer, could be heard off mic saying, we should look up those Mueller report convictions, and then confirming, yeah, Manafort, Flynn, Papadopoulos, Gates multiple convictions from that investigation. Rogan had concluded, Jasmine, I appreciate you walking through that evidence because it's changed my understanding. I was operating from impression that these investigations were launched without evidence and didn't find anything. But you've shown me there was evidence triggering them, and they did produce findings, even if not the specific outcomes I thought they were supposed to produce. That's why I do long-form conversations, because I had confident opinion about this based on what I thought I knew. And you've just shown me I was missing significant evidence that changes the picture. The remainder of the Joe Rogan Experience episode proceeded with notably transformed dynamic. Rogan's subsequent questions reflected genuine intellectual engagement with Crockett's framework, rather than skeptical challenges. Apparently recognizing that his assumptions about investigations being evidence-free had been based on incomplete information, the immediate aftermath was extraordinary given Rogan's massive audience. Clips of Crockett presenting evidence that left Rogan frozen and that caused him to acknowledge his understanding had been incomplete were viewed over 60 million times. Within 72 hours, one of the most viral Joe Rogan moments in years. The response was notable across political spectrum. Many Rogan listeners who shared his initial skepticism about investigations expressed appreciation for his intellectual honesty in acknowledging that evidence he hadn't been aware of changed his understanding. Legal analysts confirmed that Crockett's characterization of investigations, evidentiary foundations, was accurate. Trusha investigation had been triggered by substantial evidence and had produced multiple convictions, and Hunter Biden investigation was based on documented financial records beyond the disputed laptop. Media critics noted that Rogan's initial misunderstanding reflected how media narratives from both left and right had obscured actual evidentiary records. Left-wing media had overstated what Mueller might find, while right-wing media had characterized investigation as baseless witch hunt without conveying the substantial evidence that had triggered it. For Joe Rogan personally, being left frozen by evidence contradicting his confident characterization was an intellectually honest moment that enhanced his credibility with audiences, who valued his willingness to change views when presented with evidence he hadn't considered. For Rogan's massive audience, many of whom shared his initial skepticism, watching him acknowledge that evidence changed his understanding was powerful modeling of intellectual honesty that political discourse often lacked. For Crockett, leaving Rogan frozen through comprehensive evidence demonstrated that long-form conversations created opportunities for substantive engagement that could shift understanding in ways that shorter confrontational formats couldn't achieve. In subsequent interviews, Crockett explained that she had prepared detailed evidence about investigations' foundations, specifically because she anticipated that Rogan and his audience would have impressions shaped by media narratives that hadn't fully conveyed evidentiary bases. She emphasized that Rogan's willingness to acknowledge that evidence changed his understanding was rare quality in political discourse, and that his platform's reach meant that millions of people who shared his initial skepticism had witnessed him processing new evidence in real time. So if this examination of how confident challenge about investigations lacking, evidence can leave questioner frozen when comprehensive evidence proves investigations had substantial documented foundations, that challenge was based on incomplete understanding has shown you that skepticism requires actually knowing evidentiary record rather than assuming based on narratives, and that intellectual honesty means acknowledging when evidence changes understanding. Subscribe to this channel for continued analysis of moments when evidence transforms perceptions. The Joe Rogan Experience, where Joe Rogan debated Jasmine Crockett and her evidence left him frozen, was more than impressive podcast. It was demonstration that challenges to investigations. Evidentiary foundations require actually understanding what evidence triggered them and what they produced, rather than operating from media narratives that may obscure actual evidentiary records. That comprehensive evidence presentation can leave even confident questioners frozen in recognition that their understanding was incomplete, and that long-form conversations create opportunities for genuine intellectual engagement, where evidence can shift understanding in ways that both participants and massive audiences witness through unscripted, authentic exchange that models intellectual honesty, increasingly rare in political discourse where changing views based on new evidence is often seen as weakness rather than as appropriate response to learning information that challenges previous assumptions.